You know, it's crazy that in a year so full of amazing games and experiences, that one still so clearly is the best of them all, or at least the one most deserving of a Game of the Year status. Not only because of its immense quality, but also because of how it propelled an entire otherwise niche genre into the mainstream and showed the world just how great hardcore RPGs can really be with this amount of love and care put into them. And that game is Gollum. No, I'm just kidding, it's Baldurs Gate 3. Because you see, Baldurs Gate 3 is more than just another great RPG in a landscape so full of them. Whatever that phrase even means anymore. It's a game that was 6 years in the making, of which 3 were spent in early access getting feedback from players and fans alike, and all of these learnings, along with experience from making their Divinity series, allowed Larian to finally make a game that could lift this underrated genre of CRPGs into the spotlight, becoming one of the most popular releases in history, topping the charts on Steam and consoles alike. The real crowning achievement of this game, though, is how Larian was able to finally put the role-playing back in role-playing games, and craft a journey that not only was full of countless great characters and deep mechanics, but also a world that radically realized so many of your actions, allowing a sense of player agency with high production values unlike anything we've ever seen before. I said it back in my original First Impressions review of the game when it was released, and I'll say it again. What really makes Baldurs Gate 3 so special is that it isn't just another RPG. It's in many ways even more of an immersive sim, focused on making a playground that you can make your own. Depending on what class you play as, what race you pick, and all of the decisions you make in dialogue, or even just what spells you use and where, drastically affect how the game plays out and what it becomes. There are entire massive locations full of lore and quests that can only be accessed if you are searching meticulously through each environment and stumble upon a secret passageway. And while this means almost no players will ever see everything this game has to offer, what you do discover feels so much more impactful and memorable because it was something you did, not just another adventure the main narrative and cutscenes took you down. More than anything though, Baldurs Gate 3 is, at least for me, exactly what games as a medium should be all about, letting you solve every situation in any way you see fit, and crafting believable reactions to almost anything you can think of. This isn't just leveling up your speech skill and passing a dialogue check like in many other RPGs. You often have to come up with solutions to problems in the environment on your own. And when you do get speech checks, instead of it just being a boring pass or fail, you get to experience the thrill of rolling a set of dice like at a table with D&D and adding modifiers to see if you succeed. And even if you do fail, it often leads to some of the coolest and funniest encounters and moments in the entire game. A system like this is honestly how most RPGs should be doing it, where chance and luck play an integral part in the fun, and more importantly, in making your playthrough special and your own. And speaking of special, every choice you make massively affects the world and your experience in it. For example, as a druid, you can turn into a spider and speak to evil arachnids underground and convince them to join a spider queen and rebel. Or you can transform into a wolf in town and watch as innocent civilians freak out and run for their lives. Or maybe you even decide you want to become a bear in a much more intimate moment. And all of these interactions are specific to just the druid class. That one simple decision you made at the start of your game cascades into its own unique and flavorful playthrough even hundreds of hours later. If you are a gnome, you can fit into small holes and hard to reach places without spells, be made fun of by kids for how short you are, or be subjugated to less movement per turn. As a drow ranger, you can completely bypass entire encounters in the first act of the game, as the goblins will cower in fear when you walk by them because of the stories they have heard of your kind, instead of fighting you like they usually would. Even from the moment you hit the character creation screen, everything in Baldurs Gate 3 is just such a breath of fresh air, where every decision you make, no matter how big or small, can result in drastic effects to the world and story that you uncover, and it makes every single time you level up so fun, where every new spell can completely change how you roleplay as your character or your party. In the first act alone, there are hundreds of options you can use to assault a massive goblin camp, for instance. You can talk your way in, poison the local food and water supply so everyone dies without even casting a single spell, cover your face in dung so the goblins all laugh at you and let you through, summon a horde of massive ogres to cause chaos, go in and murder hobo everything, or just act like you are siding with them and then at the last second betray them all when they least expect it. In fact, you might even set up a string of hundreds of explosive barrels that you then set off miles away, which kills everything in an instant. And it's that level of agency and freedom which separates and elevates games above the likes of movies and books in the first place, and the main reason I'm so passionate about this industry. No matter what you choose to do in Baldur's Gate 3, there is a believable and interesting reaction from the game that shows you firsthand this is a playground whose only limit in most cases is your own imagination. And isn't that what RPGs were always about from their inception? Becoming digital versions of the freedom we see in tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons. Because games can provide experiences like this where the story truly becomes your own. No two playthroughs will quite be the same. And on top of this too, in combat or even just traversing the world, it's so amazing. You can get spells that allow you to fly up to the top of buildings or sneak up on foes or NPCs, or other incantations that transform you into a gaseous form to quite literally travel through pipes or small cracks in infrastructure to get to never before seen spots. For me too, the turn-based nature of the combat itself is so good because of how tactical it is and how much it makes you think, especially as a player who is completely new to the genre in Dungeons and Dragons. You will go up against epic monsters that are huge in size and seemingly with infinite health pools, along with spells that can wipe your party in an instant. And you still can find a way to win, not through mind-numbing number crunching like in the Pathfinder series, but through actually using the environment, pushing people to their death, and just trying out things to see how spells interact with the world and environment. Even for people that aren't into games with a camera system like this or combat that is turn-based, the game itself and the systems on offer here are so good that it makes it all worth it. Trust me, even if you don't think this game looks like it's for you, once you start playing and truly see how open-ended everything you can do is, and how much the game will react to those things you do, you'll realize what makes it so special and why it's the game of the year. And the thing is, all of this in one package is really what makes Baldur's Gate 3 the clear game of the year, even in a 12-month period filled to the brim with so many great titles. Because you see, it's so rare we get a game that's not only so long and full of content, but one where all of that content is also of the highest quality and interacts with one another seamlessly. And on top of that, the studio, Larian, behind it all, has continued to push patch after patch long after release, improving so many parts of the game, even for free, adding hours of content at the end of the game to flesh out what was otherwise a rushed and horrible ending to a great journey, on top of patching the countless bugs and issues you would run into much later in the second half of the journey that most people didn't even know about at first because of how long it took to even get there. This level of commitment and care for the game and customer base is what so many people love to see in this industry, and it proves the secret to making a great game is having a great studio, or in other words, great leadership. In fact, for me, the only big downside to this game is the romance. It feels like every single companion and character is trying to fornicate with you constantly, and the over-sexualization of absolutely everything, even the villains themselves, becomes so tiring and sad to see when it's obvious how good the writers otherwise were. They fell into the trap we see nowadays in everything, everyone over-sexualizing themselves and others. It would have been so much better if most of the characters were more focused on their journey and arc as a person, instead of just feeling like a vessel that's trying to convince me to go to bed with them. But despite all of that, much of the writing and moments are still so memorable, and cool companion stories and quests make up for all the times they made me feel uncomfortable back at camp. And for me, Baldur's Gate 3 is just the best RPG ever made, on the whole at least, because it did so many things right and has so much content at such a high bar of quality and production value that it quite literally is unlike anything else we've ever seen in this space before, and in many ways sets a new standard other studios will surely be looking to achieve in the future. It has close to the openness of a Skyrim, the party dynamics of a Mass Effect or Dragon Age, the deep systematic design of a Prey or Deus Ex, with a mechanical depth approaching the Pathfinder series. Or in other words, my dream game, besides the whole not being in sci-fi part. An instant classic that decades from now will be looked back on with so much nostalgia from those of us playing now, as not only the game of the year, but a game that will hopefully transform the industry and medium for the better going forward. One of the few games to reach legendary status upon even its initial release. And you can't ask for much more from a game of the year than that, can you? However, Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't the only title that reached for the stars in 2023. But sadly, not everything hit the mark. There's almost nothing I like more in games than an amazing world with deep lore, along with a narrative that makes the universe come alive and feel lived in with its own personality. And that's because as much as great gameplay and controls are paramount to games as a whole, it's those stories and worlds that stick with me. Not how great a game felt to play at the time, I already have enough fun games to play. It's the exact reason I originally fell so in love with the Mass Effect series, and to this day still think the first entry is by far the best, despite the gameplay being the worst. But sadly, it's also something that is so seldom pulled off well in games, meaning the select few that do really stick with me. So when I first heard that Owlcat would be making a CRPG set in the well-known Warhammer 40k universe, I knew it would be the perfect time to finally jump in and get engrossed in the setting I for so long had avoided. You see, this was actually the year I finally started getting into the CRPG genre in general. After giving Baldurs Gate 3 a shot, I decided I wanted to go back and play some of the greats that this niche and hardcore community had. And what I discovered is that it might be one of the best, if not the best genres out there, full stop. From modern classics like Wasteland 3, Pillars of Eternity, and Tyranny, to old masterpieces like Planescape Torment, the genre is so full of deep mechanics and interesting worlds that I couldn't help but fall in love. And Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader is no different, breathing life into one of the most interesting settings out there with some of the most insane lore I've ever seen. You see, Warhammer 40k is all about, well, war. And in Rogue Trader, this immediately becomes apparent. You play as a newly appointed rogue trader who has the rights from the God Emperor to travel to the fringes of the known galaxy and discover new trading routes, enemies, and adventures along the way. It's not often in fantasy that you get to start out feeling like the king with infinite money and resources, but here it all works. Because Warhammer is so full of warring and massive factions that being a rogue trader is essentially an entry point for having any sort of power. And considering some of the foes and interdimensional beings you will go up against, you're gonna need all the help you can get. What really makes the lore and world building in this title so good though is just how gritty it is, how unforgiving the world can really be. Even on your capital ship, you quickly come to realize that this hulking brute is only kept afloat through manpower of thousands of essentially slaves working on the lower decks, who must work non-stop until their bodies give out, toiling away on machines and electronics to help your ship traverse the unknown. And for some unlucky few as well, they're even transformed into servitors, which are half-human, half-machine hybrids which are forced to work away no matter what. You get to visit planets full of millions of innocent people who might succumb to religious fanatics. You get to decide the fate of quite literally entire portions of the galaxy, all because you were given a right from birth from a galaxy-spanning fascist regime. The stakes are unbelievably high, and because of that, everything you do feels so important. Every new colony you establish, new boss you decide to kill or spare, and any encounter with anyone feels like it could spark a rebellion that would ruin the lives of millions. It's everything that makes the 40k setting so great in the first place, a focus on the brutality, violence, and war of it all, and for someone like me who has never dived into the Warhammer setting, it immediately hooked me. On top of that too, the game is a lot of fun with so many deep builds and classes to explore, a large variety of planets and stories to uncover, including abandoned space stations and ships drifting in eerie parts of space. And while the game and especially combat starts slow and most of the dialogue isn't voice acted, meaning it can at times feel like you're reading an interactive novel more than playing a game, because of how deep and fascinating the lore is here, it keeps you engaged the whole time. There are even machine spirits that must be prayed to in order to keep high-tech machinery going, faster than light travel that is achieved by hiring so-called navigators, with a literal third eye they use to peer into what is called the warp, an alternate dimension full of twisted monsters and horrors alike. And the smaller, more human stories are just as good too, about people fighting for an ancient god emperor trapped in a tomb because of a duty they feel to protect the human race, those just trying to keep their families alive, and others who serve the will of all-knowing gods stuck in parallel dimensions. The setting lends itself to so many interesting narratives that can be spun up, and the intensity of it all, with violence and evil everywhere you look at, make it a universe that is hard to stomach at times, but one you can't stop thinking about. Even things like traveling from one solar system to another involves mountains of text that inform you as the captain about the horrific hallucinations poorer people undergo in the warp dimension on the lower decks during jumps, or tales from each planet you capture and maintain as they develop with interesting sci-fi stories that are as fascinating as they are gruesome and brutal. And to me, that's what makes for the best type of lore and world building. Settings where you can't help but not look away and wonder what the true evils and powers out there are in a universe so grand grand and infinite. So when you tie that in with super deep turn-based mechanics where you will be meticulously thinking about each move, it makes playing Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader such an engaging time. Don't get me wrong, it's a game that requires a lot of you, whether that be copious amounts of reading, build crafting and synergizing, or settlement and trade management, but if you really dedicate the amount of time this game begs for you and dive into things like the encyclopedia and different worlds and all their rich lore, you really come out with a newfound or strengthened love for one of the most long-standing fantasy sci-fi universes out there. To be honest, as someone that always thought Warhammer looked kind of cringy and weird with the buff space marines and endless armies of monsters, this is the first game that finally made me understand why the world of Warhammer is so beloved by so many, and it has some of the rawest and coolest lore I've ever seen in a game setting. For life now, I'm always going to be looking for more Warhammer content because the universe is just that awesome. And even with all the bugs the game had on its initial release and the issues with things like long turn timers and hard to understand mechanics, it's not often we get a new game series that provides a world and lore to get so utterly lost in. So trust me, if you love great sci-fi or storytelling, give this underrated game a shot. Sometimes even the initial playthrough or impression of a game can be the one that leaves a mark and tells a story that lasts with you for a long time. And maybe the best surprise of the entire year for me was none other than Hi-Fi Rush. It's the type of game that in most circumstances I never would have given a shot, but because of its awesome shadow drop reveal and release on the same day, I decided to. Because you see, Hi-Fi Rush is a lot more than just another rhythm action game full of combos. It's a title that's full of heart and a lovable cast of characters, along with one of the funnest soundtracks of all time. And all that comes together in a package with a whimsical and memorable art style and animation framework that puts most big budget anime to shame. Maybe the most surprising part of all though is that Tango Gameworks' previous games were horror bouts full of jump scares and psychological torture, while Hi-Fi Rush couldn't be any further from that. Screaming monsters are swapped out for comedic robots, dark hallways for giant colorful landscapes, and demented scenes for moments full of upbeat music blasting as you take down a big boss. And more than any other game I played this year, Hi-Fi is all about the fun, so singularly focused on that one goal of making sure the player at every moment is just having a good time. Bosses don't take themselves too seriously, your team is used for comedic relief half the time, and your main character is a bumbling buffoon but with such an endearing heart for others. At times it even feels like the Saturday morning cartoons of old, but here with even better writing where there will be multiple times where cutscenes will actually have you laughing, or others where you will be amazed by what's going on screen. At the core of it all though is the music, and it really highlights how important music is in games. For each hit of the rhythm on beat while playing the game, the world will move along to that same beat as you go. And in order to pull off the strongest combos in game, you need to time your attacks and movements right on the beat in order to make every encounter hit. For each hit of the rhythm while playing the game, the world will move along to the beat as you go. And in order to pull off the strongest combos in game, you need to time your attacks and movements right on the beat in order to take on the hardest encounters. It can be jarring at first, but once you get the hang of it, Hi-Fi really shines as you almost feel like you're part of a musical as you dash and bash your way through each environment while your character and you are both bobbing to the beat. And this only gets more impressive during boss battles, where famous and recognizable music scores start to blare as you work to figure out how to take down each boss, some of which have very unique mechanics and cutscenes that make it all so fun. Especially on that first playthrough too, there are so many times where I was surprised with just how good the characters and games are. Usually when a smaller title like this shadow drops, it turns out to be cool but nothing special. But here, every single character you met, whether friend, foe, or animatronic cat, has a ton of personality and adds a lot to every scene. In fact, my favorite moments in this entire game weren't the combat or boss battles at all, but actually the scenes where you get to see your team come together, or the more heartfelt moments that make this game a lot more than just another action adventure. Because at the core of Hi-Fi Rush is a soul full of amazing music, very memorable characters, and some moments that will have you grinning from ear to ear because of what's happening on screen. And on top of all of that too, the transitions from cutscene to gameplay are so impressive and seamless and make it feel like one moment you're playing an awesome new rhythm game and the next you're watching the new best sci-fi cartoon out there. Truly though, the reason Hi-Fi Rush was the most surprising game for me this year is because it managed to make me fall in love with a genre I otherwise usually dislike and avoid, and turn me from a skeptic into someone who absolutely adores the game. Especially the final 3 levels are just such a mastery of storytelling, endearing moments, epic fights, and great music that I hope more than anything Xbox greenlights a big budget sequel to this game that maybe more people can finally reach out and see what makes this series so awesome.